Wellington, Florida. A bright, sunny morning. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Inside a luxurious home, a family was getting ready to celebrate a special occasion, the 7th birthday of their twin boys. The house was supposed to be filled with balloons, cake, and laughter. The boys were excited, counting down the hours to their big day. But just hours before the party, everything changed. Their father, Neal Jacobson, picked up a gun and pulled the trigger. His wife, his sons, all three collapsed inside the very home they once called their safe haven. What could drive a successful man, a father who once loved his family deeply, to commit such a brutal act? To truly understand this story, we need to rewind the clock, all the way back to 1989. That was the year Neal Mason Jacobson first met Frankie Sue Sulkoff inside a gym in Bayside, Queens, New York. At the time, both were living and working in the city, each chasing their own version of success. From the very first meeting, they seemed like a perfect match. Frankie was rising through the ranks at the prestigious Lehman Brothers, while Neal had already built a company of his own on Long Island. Young, ambitious, successful. They were the embodiment of the so-called American dream. Friends and family described their relationship as one built on deep love and mutual admiration. Frankie trusted Neal completely, and Neal, in the eyes of everyone who knew him, was the golden boy, intelligent, charismatic, charming, and seemingly without flaw. It didn't take long before the two were married and moved into Neal's home in New Jersey to start their life together. Neal and Frankie Jacobson's marriage started off smoothly. Neal continued to thrive in the mortgage banking industry, eventually launching a company of his own. Frankie remained committed to her career in finance. They lived comfortably, successfully, and often escaped together on weekend getaways, cycling, scuba diving, enjoying life. From the outside looking in, they were the picture of a perfect couple. But behind that polished image, a quiet ache lingered. They couldn't have children. For years, Neal and Frankie struggled with infertility. They tried everything, every treatment, every option. Each round brought hope, followed by heartbreak. It was a long, exhausting journey, physically, emotionally, but they never gave up. And finally, in 2003, a miracle. Frankie gave birth to twin boys, Joshua and Eric, the dream of a complete family. After all the pain had finally come true. They had everything: a cozy home, adorable twin boys, and a life most people could only dream of. But for Neal Jacobson, somehow, it still wasn't enough. After years of living a stable life in New Jersey, Neal's parents, Harold and Goldie, decided to retire and move to Florida in 2000. But the distance quickly created an emotional void. Being far from family left feeling disappointed and disconnected. They missed their son, missed their grandsons, and made no secret of their longing to be closer. Then, in 2005, everything changed. Harold was diagnosed with cancer, a fast-moving illness that made any return to New Jersey impossible. It was a turning point for Neal. Unable to bear being far from his father during such a critical time, Neal made a life-altering decision. He would move his entire family to Florida. Even before they left New Jersey, Neal had already started making big bets. He began investing in Florida real estate. First, a pre-construction condo in Lantana, then another house, and then a third. The real estate boom had him hooked. Neal knew he was pushing their finances to the edge, but he didn't stop. Meanwhile, Frankie was growing worried. She asked questions. She voiced concerns. But Neal had made up his mind, and once he did, there was no changing it. After acquiring several properties in Florida, Neal started pressuring Frankie to leave their home in New Jersey. But Frankie didn't give in easily. She loved that house, Every wall held a memory, the community they belonged to, the stability they had worked so hard to build. It wasn't something she could let go of. Still, the financial strain kept tightening. The mortgage became a burden they could no longer carry. Eventually, Frankie agreed to move, reluctantly. The Jacobsons relocated to Florida, hoping to start a new chapter, closer to Neal's parents. But hope quickly gave way to heartbreak. Neal had planned to sell their old home before the big move, but the real estate market had gone cold, and that door slammed shut. With no other choice, he decided to rent the house out, a last-ditch effort to salvage their crumbling finances. Then, just 2 months after they arrived in Florida, tragedy struck. Harold Jacobson, the father Neal had sacrificed everything to be closer to, died suddenly. His death shattered Neal in ways no one could have predicted. He had uprooted his entire life just to be near his dad, only to lose him almost immediately after arriving. Frankie watched her husband crumble under a grief that never quite showed on the surface. And Neal's mother began to reveal long-buried truths. Since his teenage years, Neal had struggled silently with obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. Doctors had once noted that he was consumed with being the perfect child, a pressure that never let go, even as he became a man. Default text over the years, Neal's battle with anxiety didn't fade. It grew, like an undertow quietly gaining strength beneath the surface. And then, everything spiraled out of control. When the housing market collapsed during the Great Recession, Neal Jacobson's world began to crack. As a mortgage broker, Neal found himself at the heart of the economic storm. The real estate market crumbled almost overnight. The job that once gave him wealth, investment opportunities, and a sense of control vanished like smoke. The financial security he had believed was unshakable began to erode, layer by painful layer. The condos he had poured money into before leaving New Jersey were no longer assets. They had become burdens. The financial security he had believed was unshakable began to erode, layer by painful layer. The condos he had poured money into before leaving New Jersey were no longer assets. They had become burdens. At first, Neal tried to hold on to an old belief that he could manage it, just like he always had before. He was the one who kept things under control, who kept his family safe. But this time, things were far beyond his reach. 4 separate mortgages, almost no income, and pressure mounting day after day. Frankie, his partner through it all, stood by him. Together, they scraped through their last savings, trying to hold together a life that was falling apart piece by piece. But the bills kept piling up. The debt collectors kept calling. Tension lingered at the dinner table, in every glance, in every silence. Neal slowly began to spiral. He started making desperate decisions, and then buried one mistake beneath the next. Risky investments, high-interest loans. At one point, he nearly sold what little they had left. All of it just to keep a sinking ship afloat. But it was too late, and deep down, he knew it. Every last dollar of their savings was gone. Frankie, physically and emotionally exhausted, was forced to make a decision she never imagined she'd have to make. She stopped paying the mortgages on their 3 Florida condos. It was surrender, and they have no way back. By 2008, Neal's business failures had begun leaving visible marks, not just on his finances, but on his body and mind. It started subtly, a few aches and pains, strange sensations he couldn't quite explain. But week after week, the symptoms worsened. His body slowed down. His mind grew foggy, dim. Even the simplest tasks left him drained, struggling to stay upright. The dizziness came often, like a warning bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Concerned, Neal went to see a doctor. A series of blood tests were run in October, and the results left everyone puzzled. His hormone levels were unusually high, but no one could explain why. While answers remained out of reach, Neal's condition continued to deteriorate. The man who had once been energetic, capable, and confident was now quiet, withdrawn. Eventually, he was diagnosed with severe depression and benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, a condition that left him feeling dizzy and off balance almost constantly. Doctors prescribed Zoloft, a common antidepressant. Neal, desperate to feel like himself again, began taking the medication regularly, but instead of light, the darkness deepened. Just days later, he was called back to the clinic. This time, they prescribed Xanax, a drug meant to ease anxiety, at least in theory. What happened next terrified his family. Neal began to change, rapidly, noticeably, and in ways that were deeply unsettling. He became impulsive, harder to predict. His moods shifted erratically, like the tide. Paranoia began to creep into his thoughts, quietly but relentlessly. The man Frankie and his loved ones once knew, calm, intelligent, devoted, started to vanish. Neal grew increasingly paranoid. He believed someone or something was watching him, tracking him, waiting to do him harm. Frankie, his wife, began to realize something was deeply wrong. In desperation, she turned to her sister, Shirkazanin, pleading for help. She no longer knew what to do as Neal slipped further into a world no one else could enter. He began cutting off all contact with the outside. No friends, no family. He wouldn't even step outside the house. He locked himself in, as if their home had become a fortress against some unseen enemy. Neal believed he was being watched by federal agents, that they were building a case, setting him up, fabricating a crime that never happened. His delusions became more elaborate. He insisted their phone was tapped, that someone was monitoring his every move from just outside the window, that at any moment, a black unmarked car would pull up out front, and they'd storm in. Even his mother had witnessed it firsthand. During one of her rare visits, Neal pulled her aside, his voice trembling, eyes wide with panic. He told her he was in serious trouble. He was convinced the FBI was coming for him. She asked what he had done, but Neal couldn't explain. He just kept repeating that something terrible had happened, something even he couldn't put into words. But the fear in his eyes was real, undeniable, icy, and unbearable for anyone who saw it. On the morning of January 23, 2010, the darkness Neal Jacobson had been battling for months finally swallowed him whole. And then the nightmare began. That morning, Neal stood silently in front of the closet. His hand trembled as he reached for the top shelf. A gun sat there, partially hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. Frankie was still half asleep, her mind drifting in the soft haze of early morning light. She looked at her husband, first with confusion, then fear, and finally, with horror, because she realized the gun in his hand wasn't for protection. Neal stepped away from the closet. His face was cold, emotionless. Every trace of the man Frankie had once loved was gone. He wasn't Neal anymore. Frankie lunged. She tried to grab the gun, fought him on the floor. A blur of screaming, sobbing, sheer desperation. She took a brutal blow to the mouth, her front teeth shattered. Blood, tears, a deep gash tore across her hand. But Frankie didn't stop. She fought for her life. She fought to save her family. Neal was stronger, and in that moment, completely unhinged. He got to his feet, calmly reloaded the weapon, and pointed it at his wife. Two sharp cracks broke the silence. Both bullets struck Frankie in the face. She collapsed, and just like that, she was gone. But Neal's rampage wasn't over. He left the bedroom, walked down the hallway, a trail of blood behind him, and entered the room of his eldest son, Eric. The boy was lying face down, peacefully asleep. He didn't know his mother was already dead. He didn't know he was next. Neal fired 2 shots. Eric was badly wounded, but still alive. Neal didn't stop. He grabbed a pillow, pressed it over his son's face, and fired 2 more times. This time, Eric didn't survive. A heavy silence fell over the house, but it wasn't the end. Neal opened the next door, Joshua's room, his younger son. The little boy was still asleep, wrapped tightly in his blanket, unaware that his entire world had just been shattered. Neal approached him, moving softly, like a shadow. He placed a pillow over his son's face. 2 more gunshots rang out. In just minutes, a family of 3 had been erased. The house fell into an eerie, suffocating quiet. Neal walked into the bathroom. He turned on the shower and let the water pour over him. He stood there, motionless, cold, as if trying to wash away what had just happened, but he couldn't. Afterward, he got dressed. He took a dose of Vicodin and Xanax, and then, like stepping out of a trance, he walked out of the blood-soaked home, leaving behind what could never be undone. As Neal Jacobson drove away from the crime scene, his body began reacting to the cocktail of pills he had just swallowed. A dangerous mix of Vicodin and Xanax. The effects hit fast. His mind spun. His vision blurred. Less than a mile from his mother Goldie's house, Neal lost consciousness behind the wheel. His car veered off the road and came to a stop on a patch of grass, as if fate itself had intervened to stop whatever unspeakable thing was going to happen next. Because in his disturbed state, Neal had planned to kill his mother and then take his own life. He later told police that as he stood in the living room of his own home, he thought about going to heaven to be with my father. But then another thought crept in. I couldn't leave my mother behind. So the plan changed. He would take her with him. Thankfully, he never made it. When police found Neal, he was slumped over, dazed and barely conscious, still gripping the gun. As they approached, he mumbled, his voice cracked and distant. I killed my whole family. The investigation began immediately, and one question rose to the forefront. Was Neal a cold-blooded killer, or a victim of his own unraveling mind? Detectives discovered a suicide note inside the home, scrawled in shaky handwriting, a mix of anguish and despair. It suggested that Neal may have planned the killings, or at the very least, had imagined this tragedy long before it unfolded. And so, the debate began. What truly caused this horror? Was it the medication? A mental illness? Or was it Neal himself, fully aware, fully conscious, who chose to end his family's story in blood? From the very beginning, Neal Jacobson's legal strategy centered on his mental state. His defense attorney argued that Neal didn't kill out of anger, hatred, or violence. He was a man falling apart. A man suffering from severe depression, persistent paranoia, and the terrifying belief that the FBI was monitoring his every move. A man drowning in a deep financial crisis. And all of it, every crack in his world, became unmanageable when prescribed medications like Zoloft and Xanax pushed him to the very edge of sanity. The defense brought in medical experts to testify about the serious psychiatric risks associated with the drugs Neal had been prescribed. According to them, the combination of Zoloft and Xanax, especially at high doses, can cause extreme mood swings, hallucinations, delusional thinking, and even suicidal ideation. Neal's behavior leading up to the murders was presented as evidence. He had become isolated, paranoid, refused to leave the house, and seemed to lose his grip on reality. His attorney described him as a devoted father, with no history of violence, the kind of man no one would ever expect to commit such a horrific act. Was that really the behavior of someone in full control of their actions? The defense asked, but prosecutors pushed back hard. They painted a very different picture, not of a mentally ill man, but of someone who had carefully planned a family annihilation. To them, Neal wasn't a victim of medication. He was a man cornered by financial collapse, and instead of facing the fallout, he made the darkest choice imaginable. He killed his entire family as a final act of control. They laid out the chilling details, one by one. Neal retrieved the gun, reloaded multiple times, and made sure no one survived. To the prosecution, this wasn't the behavior of someone sleepwalking through a psychotic episode. It was calculated. It was deliberate. The proof? The suicide note. A sheet of paper found at the scene where Neal had written his final words. Not messy, not rushed. The handwriting was clear, composed, intentional, almost like a declaration. A message that showed he had fully thought through what he was about to do and accepted it. To the prosecutors, that wasn't the sign of someone spiraling out of control. It was the act of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. Then came the witnesses. One after another, they testified to Neal's deteriorating mental state in the days and weeks before the murders. According to them, Neal had become deeply paranoid. He spoke often about the FBI watching him, convinced that federal agents were preparing to arrest him. An invisible fear had begun to eat away at his sanity. Even Frankie, his wife, could no longer keep silent. She confided in her sister, Shur Kazanin, that the man she once married was gone. He had stopped showering, refused to leave the house, and his gaze had become distant, as if he were trapped inside his own mind. The defense seized on these details to argue that Neal was in the middle of a complete mental breakdown, incapable of controlling his actions. But the prosecution flipped the narrative. They said these weren't signs of psychosis. They were red flags, clear warnings, silent cries for help that should have led to professional intervention. Not mass murder. One of the most heart-wrenching moments in the courtroom came when Goldie, Neal's mother, took the stand. She had been one of the last people to see Neal alive, before everything fell apart. Her voice trembled as she recounted the moment. Her son looked her in the eyes and said, "Mom, I love you. No matter what happens." The courtroom fell silent. At the time, Goldie hadn't understood the weight behind those words. But now, with hindsight piecing together the past, everything was suddenly clear. Neal had been preparing. Goldie, who had always seen her son as a gentleman, a devoted husband and loving father, now faced an unbearable truth. Her child was standing trial for killing his entire family. And like everyone else in that courtroom, she no longer knew what to believe. In the end, the decision lay with the jury. They weren't just tasked with determining guilt or innocence. They had to answer a far darker question. Was Neal Jacobson truly out of control, driven by medication and mental illness? Or was he cold, calculated, and fully aware of his actions when he killed his entire family? The prosecution stood firm in its argument. They didn't flinch. They didn't sugarcoat the horror. They looked the truth in the eye. Neal Jacobson carried out a deliberate series of actions. He loaded the gun. He raised it. He pulled the trigger, again and again, at the people he once called family. To the state, it didn't matter what Neal was facing, debt, delusion, or psychological decline. Nothing could justify the execution of a devoted wife and 2 innocent children. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for compassion. They didn't paint Neal as a monster, but as a broken man, consumed by paranoia, crushed under despair, and stripped of reason by fear and mental illness. A man lost in a downward spiral he couldn't escape. But after every piece of evidence was weighed, every testimony considered, the verdict was clear. Even while acknowledging the tragic circumstances and Neal's emotional collapse, the judge left no room for doubt. No financial hardship, no mental illness can ever excuse the murder of 2 innocent children and a loving wife. Neal Jacobson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, imprisoned not only by concrete walls, but by the memory of what he took away. Could this tragedy have been prevented if Neal had received better treatment? Did medication push him past the point of no return? Or was this simply the choice of a man who couldn't face failure? No one can say for certain, but one fact is undeniable. A devoted wife and 2 innocent children lost their lives in one of the most horrific ways imaginable. And nothing, no explanation, no theory can erase that truth. What about you? What do you think drove Neal Jacobson to commit such an unthinkable act? Was it financial pressure? A side effect of the drugs? Or a deeper darkness within his mind that no one ever truly saw? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you found this video valuable and want to help bring more stories like this to light, please like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes silence can be just as dangerous.